Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I hope some ladies are actually watching. This is the Waxcast with your host, Gavin Wax. Today is episode 6, day 3, and we are joined by a good friend of mine, a Florida man and assistant editor at the Mises Institute and the newly minted vice chair of the Bay County GOP. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tho Bishop. Tho, thank you for joining.
Well, it is great to join you, the now infamous Gavin Wax. Guys are doing great stuff up there.
Hopefully not too infamous. I don't want to end up in a gulag, but I'm sure we'll get to that as well. But I wanted to bring you on because you're a great political and economic thinker. I'm a big fan of the Mises Institute, the work that you guys do there. So I want to touch on a bit about the overlaps with Austrian economics, politics, formerly maybe more libertarian politics, maybe now more paleo-conservative, paleo-libertarian, maybe even paleo-populist. We can get into all of that and more. But let's start off with the state of the Mises Institute now. How is everything going? You're one of the few organizations that, formally may have described themselves as libertarian that I still hold a lot of respect for. You don't seem to have drifted into the Lawbergism of many other institutions, which have just basically embraced social liberalism and Koch-funded money and, globalism as their new mantras. I mean, what's going on over there at Mises?
Yeah, well, this 2020 was really one of our biggest years ever, I think. I mean, one of the things that we're particularly proud of is that, in spite of everything that's gone on, the entire year we kept holding, events in person. We even were able to do our Mises University program, which, historically we typically have about 150 students from all around the world that come in. This year is smaller. We have fewer faculty, but still we were able to pull it off. And I think one of the cool things about the Institute is that we've always kind of in our DNA, it's been the resistance to empire and also the understanding that we have to build our own institutions. So we've kind of been fighting a lot of these battles that the right is now fully recognizing for going back since we were founded in the 80s. And so I think it's really exciting that a lot of this stuff is coming into exactly where we've always been. And so, we've been.
Sorry, but I'm in New York City, and we get some weird sounds every now and then.
That's okay, as long as no alligators start to break in here. We're going to be good on my end, but we know that we're seeing the consequences play out in blue cities around the country when you allow the enemies to educate your kids. And the Mises Institute has always been against it. Mises University, it's a program explicitly designed to kind of cram in a week, what you'd get in 4 years. So you learn real economics, real history. So that's the sort of stuff that we've been trying to focus on. And, I've been doing a video series, Economics for Beginners, trying to help, if you understand economics, a lot of the arguments from the left go away. We've been publishing books. Our traffic's the highest it's ever been. And again, we understand, I think perhaps more than most of the other libertarian organizations out there, that the danger to civilization is the left. And Ludwig von Mises understood that as well as anyone. Murray Rothbard understood as well as anyone.
Well, that's what I want to bring up next. I want to bring up Murray Rothbard, who was an alumni of the New York Young Republican Club, funny enough. You and others at the Mises Institute have not shied away from politics. In your introduction, I said that you are now a vice chair of your local GOP party, which I always found admirable because I view, in all of the above approach, I don't think it should just be solely academic. It shouldn't just be solely within media. You should also engage in politics. And I came into politics with Ron Paul, like many others. I think that's how I found you. And he also took that approach, also embracing the political side of things, not the end all be all, but part of the many different pillars to fight the growing encroachment of the left and all this cultural insanity. Rothbard was a similar believer in that, if I remember correctly. And he actually kind of devised a sort of strategy that appealed to sort of maybe this conservative, populist, rural, kind of working class Buchananite base that kind of dominated maybe the South and the Midwest. And that's sort of a similar demographic that Trump draws on from now for his political movement. Do you think Rothbard kind of saw into the future in that sense? And do you think Austrian economics could tie itself into this growing populist movement that I ascribe to?
I think so. And again, if you look at the 90s, for one, in order to understand where Rothbard was in the 90s, you have to understand how he got there in the first place. And he started off as a member of the old right. Again, a proud New York City young Republican. The problem is that kind of in the peak of the Cold War era, you had like in the rise of the Buckley rights, right? You had the National Review. Yeah, and within this era, you had a lot of these institutions trying to purge out, the anti-war side of the right. They were trying to create this very respectable sort of conservative politics, which of course lost every major battle in the 20th century. And then he tried to do an alliance with the left because they were trying to push back against the American empire in Vietnam and things like that. And then he realized these are a bunch of crazy people, so he moved on. He tried to go with the third way kind of libertarian approach. He was one of the founders of the Libertarian Party, all of that. And then he realized that the people that were attracted to the Libertarian Party were a bunch of wackos. It was people that were more concerned about drug use and having polyamory than it was
the proto-Lulberg.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And it goes back to when Ron Paul tried to run for the LP, he had like a series, here he was a congressman, a great fundraiser, et cetera. And he had a serious in-person or in-party challenge by like a Native American rights activist, because you had a lot of the LP members thought, well, like Ron Paul's too square to represent us. They prided themselves on their, alternative lifestyles mattered more to like property rights, right?
Right.
And so Rothbard, after that and a few other little things, he said, well, screw these guys. Then after the Pat Buchanan movement, he's like, well, here's where I feel most comfortable, because what we have to do as libertarians or people that are interested in liberty and restoring the old republic, pushing back against the empire, we have to make our message relevant to the middle class, to the working class. And so that is what he wanted. That in the 90s, that's what his strategy with him and Lew Rockwell was focused on, is how do we make these radical ideas, given what the 20th century had created, right? This 20th century made our ideas radical. How do we make them applicable to Hank Hills, right? That just want to grill. And I think that, and now we're living in an age where we're seeing all of these globalist institutions, particularly at that post-Cold War era, where it was this intended march to these multinational organizations, hostile to nationalism in the first place. I mean, for example, the New York Times, back in the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were out there saying, oh, well, we have to keep the political, territory of the Soviet Union together. They were hostile to the nationalism that actually helped break apart this
the balkanization.
And it's like, once you start realizing that, like that, there's nothing worse than that, right? I mean, the Soviet Union was, that is
evil empire. It was truly an evil empire, and I guess the New York Times has never been on the right side of history for most things, going back to the Civil War, etc. They've always seemed to be. Well, that's another discussion. I want to talk to Thomas DiLorenzo here, but they have their own reasons. But that's definitely interesting, and it's great to see that the Mises Institute has definitely stayed ahead of the curve, so to speak. Now, is it true that you and maybe some others at the Institute have sort of dropped the libertarian term? I mean, I used to describe myself as kind of a conservative libertarian, a conservatarian. I mean, I was always conservative. I was always pro-life. I always held certain views about national sovereignty and stuff like that. Even though I was, more open to maybe some economic issues that were much more more free market. What do you identify yourself as politically now? I mean, have you shed that term completely or what?
I'm okay with kind of populist. When I'm having a normal conversation with someone here, and I'm trying to describe my views, I'll say libertarian, just because it's still a convenient word when you're talking to certain sort of people. But what I'm sick and tired of is, and this is, I think, one of the problems that plagued the liberty movement, is that we prided ourselves kind of being in this ideological ghetto, right? Like, oh, you're not a real libertarian, became an insult. It's like, well, I don't
true Scotsman.
If you don't like, if you don't think that, I don't care. Like, that my pride is not based on how libertarian I am or how I'm seen in the libertarian community. I care much more about what my neighbors think about me. I care much more about my standing in Bay County, Florida, than I do about the libertarian conference circuit. And the problem is, and the problem is that you have a lot of like libertarian, influential thinkers that they obviously, and they pine for like going back to 2012, where they were at their peak of
irrelevance.
They could go to all, you had a few major libertarian conferences a year, and they could be surrounded by fans, and it was the peak of the, and so that's why they want, libertarians should be fighting amongst ourselves. If you think Trump's great, and if you think Trump's bad, well, at least you're still here on the east. It's like, no, there is no value in libertarian homogeny. What the value comes from, if libertarians on the right should be working with the right to try to get our ideas accepted on the right. If you're a left libertarian, God bless. I don't care. Like, then work on the left and try to get libertarian ideas on the left. The worst idea possible is this third way, which is why particularly in a state like Florida, the Libertarian Party in Florida, I think is one of the greatest threats to kind of politics here.
Right.
Because I mean, if for example, if you had given how close the elections were in 2018, if you had a libertarian candidate for governor, I'm terrified that we'd be dealing with Andrew Gillum right now.
Right.
And in fact, I mean, I think one of the reasons why, like, the biggest threat to liberty in the state of Florida is our agricultural commissioner, Nikki Fried. Now, it might be, why does an agricultural commissioner matter? It's a good question. Florida, big citrus state, a lot of farm power there. More importantly, though, like, that position deals with concealed carry licenses. Now, why? Don't know. Doesn't matter. It does. And so what happened during that race, I guarantee you this, Nikki Fried got in trouble. There was a big scandal during the campaign because her bank account closed her campaign account because it was receiving money from marijuana interest. And so I guarantee you had libertarian voters out there thinking, oh, well, Nikki Fried is marijuana friendly. She's an agricultural commissioner. I'm going to vote for her on this position because these seem relevant. And I understand that thought process. The problem is that now these people have empowered the person who wants to take your guns away. And it's going to be the person that runs against Ron DeSantis.
But they can choke up. So it's so stupid. But that's the thing that pisses me off.
As long as I can get my weed delivered to me.
It's such juvenile thinking. They don't look at the big picture, and they do not make great political calculations. And my big problem with the LP, it's like, look, if you want to have a multi-party system, have a multi-party system. But what we've seen now is that the left has shut down all the left of center minor parties, Green, etc. So they consolidated their voting base while we kept the LP on the ticket, and that kind of hurt Trump in some states. I'm not saying it would have flipped the election necessarily, but it certainly has hurt us in some areas, some races. So it's either you have all parties on the ticket or you have none of the minor parties. That's how I view it. I think if you just have one that just acts as a sore thumb, and because they also get votes from just people who may vote Republican otherwise, they're not necessarily libertarian. They just vote because they figure out maybe this guy's better, but they're never better. It's always the guy in the tinfoil hat with like a rap sheet going back 10 years. But but beyond that, I mean, I also wanted to touch on maybe some of the changes we're seeing in the Republican Party. Many have talked about sort of the shift away from this free market idealism that kind of dominated the party since Reagan, which was also kind of an illusion of itself because it was really pro-business. And I've been getting into a lot of arguments with people because I remember when I was still kind of, more of a rank and file free market kind of guy, I always knew the difference between being pro-market and pro-business. And I'm getting into arguments with people all the time about Section 230 and whatever it is, and they're always presenting it as a pro-business argument. And I'm like, that's not even a libertarian argument, because you're talking about government privileges in the case of Section 230, et cetera. But the party as a whole, particularly the Republican Party is what I mean, seems to be shifting anti-business, but not necessarily anti-market. And things like protectionism are coming more to the front of the party, but they're still against taxes, for instance, and they're still against maybe the largening of the state for the most part. But do you see the way the party is shifting, the Republican Party shifting, as a positive, trending more towards liberty? I mean, some things are getting worse, some things are getting better. How do you view it?
The good thing is I think that people are seeing what they want to see kind of in the last 4 years, because I mean, Trump is not an ideological guy, right? He was a transactional guy. And what Trump was great at was taking care of the coalitions that took care of him, right? Maybe Trump's passion for the pro-life causes is genuinely comes from religious conversion.
Or Western Sahara. He's a big fan of Morocco.
That's great. And yes, exactly. Maybe that's the case. But one thing that is clear, though, is that he has gone out of his way to promote that aspect of the conservative movement because they have been extremely loyal to him. And this was a good situation all around. I think that there's an interesting study done by, it's one of those think tanks with a long name, but it was kind of, okay, what is the real motivating factors behind Trump voters? And I'm sure you can always find studies with differing conclusions, whatever. But I think, it checks out that the real motivating driver was more cultural issues than economic issues, right? Republicans realized that the left hates us.
Yep.
The right realized that our establishment politicians aren't going to stop them. They don't particularly care and hold up for us. And that's what, like, the proto-Trump movement, I think, was really Herman Cain in 2012.
Interesting.
Right? Because he was a businessman. He was from outside the system, right? Herman Cain was winning that.
I've never heard that theory before. I've never heard the proto movement was Herman Cain. That's interesting.
Well, and it's because the Tea Party rose. There was anti-establishment. And after once he was out, and like Mitt Romney was just able to consolidate.
Right.
So there was this kind of building backlash pre-Trump, doubting the sincerity or even necessarily the sincerity, the effectiveness of the Republican
and the legitimacy.
Right. And so what Trump was a reaction to that. And I think more than anything else, I don't think it's necessarily a pushback on like free markets or laissez-faire or whatever. I think it's a skepticism of consolidated power and consolidated corporate power. And this is why the one thing that, if anybody out there that is, considers himself a nationalist, or like even particularly like an economic nationalist, the issue that I think is the easiest way of kind of bridging this right libertarian and economic nationalist sort of is the Fed. And it's because, like, there's when Tucker Carlson goes on about, and rightfully so, about some of the really horrible ways that the financial services industry and vulture capitalism and things like that have destroyed hometowns and things like that, and we've had this narrowing out of that working class. The main driver of that isn't trade per se, though a lot of our international trade deals sucked, right? I mean, Murray Rothbard was
managed trade. Right. It wasn't free
these
trade.
Are not free trade agreements.
Yeah, exactly.
There were things built in there that
quotas, everything.
And it's like one of the best examples of how our nominally trade agreement or financial agreements with the countries screw us over was, it was like 2013. The Obama administration signed a memo of understanding with China, the Ministry of Finance in China, that they were going to enforce their own auditing requirements, while like America, and it's like, anybody familiar with Chinese accounting?
Auditing, yeah.
No, it was total bull. And so again, here's something that was nominally, this is about economic relations, explicitly giving advantage to Chinese firms at the detriment of American firms. And even more perversively, it was opening up investment from Western capital into Chinese state-backed enterprises. And so you had like Western investors who are idiots, right? They're greedy. I mean, it's the same people that are buying into this subprime market bubble that are actively subsidizing
state-subsidized industries.
They're subsidizing the Uyghur concentration camps in China. And so here's how, again, so that has to go to, again, some of the things that are nominally trade, no, and then but the other side it's the Fed. What the Fed does is benefit size and power at the expense of merit. It benefits investors at the expense of savers. It benefits bankers at the expense of workers. And so what we've done is we've created an entire financial system that rewards speculation and financial interest at the expense of conservatives,
savers,
risk averse. And again, that is the biggest, that's the issue.
That's very Jacksonian. It harks back to the early days of the Republic with the first populist movement with Andrew Jackson, who was against the centralized banking. I mean, and Trump looks up to Jackson in many ways. And he was actually a great president and did that. So there is common ground that could be found with this populist right and many core libertarian concepts like anti-central banking, because they always hold the value, because even the most nationalist populists, at least in the United States, there's always been a federalized component to it. There's always been a respect for local traditions, state support. These movements come from, say, states west. They're not coming from places that want to centralize more. They're coming from places that want to decentralize. So they could look at something like the Fed and say, no, I want the bank back on Main Street. I want to support small businesses, local businesses versus international businesses. So your point about the concentration of both power and wealth is 100% true. And the way I'm looking at it, I completely agree.
Well, and the interesting thing is that the history of populism in America, because like the problem, so again, like the Mises Institute, we deal with people all around the world, right? So you go to someone in Latin America and you talk about populism, they're terrified, understandably so, because populism in Latin America looks like Chavez, right? Fair. In America, though, like the tradition of populism is Jefferson, it's Jackson. It is one of my favorites, New York's own Samuel Tilden.
Yeah, you had a great post. I didn't know much about him. He posted.
Again, he was a man too good for American politics. But like what they were, so what you had was a working class coalition that was anti-state privilege, that recognized that it was state privilege that benefited big corporations and big business and railroad, all the railroad corruptions and things like that. And so it was an anti-corruption, laissez-faire, sound money political movement. And even better out, they're called the Bourbon Democrats.
The Bourbon Democrats, with Cleveland.
Yes, and so that's what we need. We need Bourbon Republicans, right? We need people that that are not afraid of being sympathetic to Southern interest and that have an appreciation for real ideas. Because the problem is that on the right, there's a lot of fixation on like cultural issues, and we need to restore we need to restore the Judeo-Christian values of America, and we need to stand up for Western civilization, all of which are absolutely true. But you can't simply focus on the cultural side at the expense of economics, because economics really is a science on understanding how do you allocate scarce resources when you have people with different wants and ends. Like that is an important component.
And that's kind of Tucker's argument, though, because he's always been presenting that the future of the party has to be sort of this working class economic coalition that, in his mind, at least in the minds of people that support Tucker in terms of what he's saying, that would be willing to sacrifice some principles of the free market to advance ourselves politically. But you're pointing out that, yes, we should focus on economics to an extent. It can't just be purely a cultural movement, but we should also double down on, say, this kind of old right classical liberalism. Am I right? Or am I wrong in how I'm describing it?
No, I think you're right. But the other important thing is that so one of the things that I think there's a caricature of free markets and libertarianism and things like that you're willing to sell your grandma for some extra GDP or something. One of the things that's important to understand is that civilizations, we have a desire for a sense of stability and safety. And the things and market products can produce this. Insurance programs, savings, all of these things are specifically designed to help the vulnerable. Because what I think the Tucker Carlson concern is that you have a lot of vulnerable good people being screwed over by modern capitalism. And he's absolutely correct on
Not
that.
Modern capitalism, modern corporatism.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's how I feel as well. And that's what the Trump movement was. There was these disenfranchised masses who lived between New York and LA who have been ignored, who've had their communities gutted economically and spiritually. Their jobs are shipped overseas. They're inundated with drugs and opioids, and the families have broken, the communities have broken, the town square has been destroyed. I mean, these are people with legitimate grievances who have been complete victims of this sort of oligarchy, this globalist oligarchy, which does very much exist, where you have, kind of these globalist corporations who have basically dominated our national policy for decades and have gutted the country. And Trump was a reaction to that, like you mentioned earlier. So there's legitimate grievances. It's just about selling the right bill of goods to fix those grievances. And is it about bigger government, or, as you say, using some imagination to see where the free market could solve these issues, if and when?
And I think another issue on these lines, and something that I definitely took for granted, and I think it's, as Americans, we take this for granted, but we're increasingly seeing it play out, is that if you don't have respect for the American nation, and the ideas that were unique to, really the ideas were unique to the Anglosphere. When I go back to talk about the Bourbon Democrats, it was a common coalition of people in the U.S., England, and Canada that kind of inspired by
the Ricardian kind of free traders.
And so you have to appreciate that, because once you start seeing our corporation again, when you have Google actively hostile to the liberal values that made that were a product of Western civilization, you start seeing them embrace the cultural tactics of China, and that's an issue. And this is again, we've incentivized these big corporations to go to China and bow down to them, because they don't have to bow down to our values here. Any big corporation in America would much rather fly a gay pride flag than show off an American flag, right? This is they don't see any market value on being proudly American, and unless you have a large Trump base out there,
or we return to the 50s.
And the thing is, though, and here's one of I think the biggest issues that are out there that is kind of going to make things very interesting going forward, is that the Chinese Communist Party really is, in my opinion, like the Soviet Union of the past. And I don't mean only that it's an evil empire, which is, I think, absolutely true. It's a uniquely rogue actor in this regard, which is, again, that doesn't justify American intervention there, but we need to recognize that.
You can't be oblivious. You can't be oblivious to the world around you.
Right. The other side of it, though, is that their economy is also a giant Ponzi scheme, just like the Soviet Union was, because it is communism with market characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
So what you have now is that you have American companies, again, like the NBA.
Well, we were never as indebted and intertwined with the Soviet economy as well, China, which makes it way scarier.
Yes.
Way scarier. And the scales are bigger, because even the Soviet Union, at the end of the day, it was always sort of a backwater, and it lagged behind the last several decades of its existence. China, on the other hand, it is a Ponzi scheme. It is kind of built on a house of cards, both internally in terms of their stability and their economy. But they have a lot of leverage over us in terms of our dependence.
Well, they have a lot of control of the world. One of the best consequences of the Trump administration was a massive decrease in Chinese investment in the U.S. Trump did more to kind of separate our economic ties than anybody thought possible. The CCP was completely caught, I think, surprised by how much of Trump was actually going to do this rhetoric.
Right.
But so what you have now, it's like, again, I think the NBA, because I'm like sports economics is total crap out there right now. But I think this kind of gets to a very interesting point. The NBA had, which NBA fans started realizing that the players playing for their team didn't care about them. Right, the NBA became a total mercenary league. It was like LeBron James will leave Cleveland.
There's no loyalty to teams. There's nothing.
And so if you're an Atlanta Hawks fan and your team's terrible and your players don't care about you, then you tune out. And so NBA ratings in the US have gone off a cliff. The NBA didn't care about that, though, because they saw the future of the sport being internationally, and particularly China. And so they were allowing this league because they thought, oh, okay, we're going to let the best basketball players play together. There's going to be no loyalty, and the Chinese are going to bail us out because you have this mentality that you have a lot of greedy, stupid heads of big corporations in the U.S. that think, oh, yeah, they had this mindset that if I sell one square of fabric to every person in China, I'll be a billionaire.
Right.
The problem is that when you're doing that. And so the way that China attracts all of these American companies, it's not because of labor markets. It's not because of economic advantage over the U.S. Because if you want cheap labor, you don't go to China anymore because of how much wages have risen in the last 20 years. You go to Bangladesh, you go to Vietnam, you go to other countries. They go to China for access to their domestic marketplace. And the problem is that when that domestic marketplace is, again, built off of a whole bunch of debt and is a giant Ponzi scheme, you have all these companies that are selling out American consumers for the hope of a future that isn't there. And once the realities of that starts crashing down in China, and the Trump's trade deal, like, again, I'm a free trade guy. I have no problem with tariffs on China because that is an issue. Because the issue there, again, it's not about economies of scale. It's about bowing down to the CCP. Free trade with anyone except recognize when you have a rogue, hostile government to our values.
Right. Who's not playing fair. Yeah. And also, I mean, I love tariffs because I think it would always be more preferential to direct taxes on individuals. I mean, I would like to see a situation where individuals and small businesses in the U.S. had an effective tax rate of 0. And we went back to what we had for most of our nation's history and what the Constitution prescribed, which was essentially just a revenue tariff. And, the greatest fights of old historically were like, oh, is the tariff going to be 20 or 28%? I mean, they all had a baseline that they supported tariffs, even in the disagreements between the South and the North. It was just, marginally the percentage points. I mean, I would love to return to that being the political dichotomy than what we're having now, where it's, completely open free trade, but raising taxes on everyone domestic. China doesn't tax anyone to the same degree. And their wealth is rising through the roof, and they're basically just a mercantilist state taking advantage of us. But the point you're making with the NBA is interesting. I mean, and many other companies are doing that. It's not just the NBA; they're abandoning the domestic.
It's just an easy example.
Yeah, it's easy, but they're abandoning the domestic market, which is not a long-term healthy position to be in as a nation. Am I right?
Yeah. No, and that's the thing, and that's gonna where I think that the appreciation for nation and it's something that, again, early on, libertarian. Kind of early libertarianism, you just took this stuff for granted, and we could take it for granted because we were raised in
we lived in the West
nation that respects liberal ideas. Yeah. And again, and that's like when you talk to people from other countries and you see the appreciation that they have, like that, and that's what, like, in Europe, like, I mean, the areas of the world that I have the most hope in right now. I'm not giving up in the U.S. yet. We've got, especially here in the free state of Florida.
Well, you guys are doing amazing in Florida. I'll tell you that. Like, Florida is today what California was 50, 60 years ago, especially as relates to New Yorkers. Everyone I know is fleeing there. What pisses me off, though, is a lot of people fleeing there still have like this kind of like smug northern disdain for the South, northern disdain for Florida, its culture, its traditions. It's like, well, if things were so great, then why are you fleeing there? Now, look, I'm a proud New Yorker. I love my city. I love my state. It's come on hard times, but I also respect what's going on in Florida, and you guys are doing great in terms of your governor, in terms of your freedoms, in terms of your economy, and it's blossoming. Hopefully you don't go the way of California, which seems to be a cyclical nature in the U.S. This prosperity, for some reason, this mass prosperity always ends up with, all the confiscation of wealth and the destruction and destitution like we're seeing in California. Hopefully Florida can buck that trend. I don't know if you agree.
Oh, I think that's a very interesting point. And I think it was Arthur Bloom from the American Conservative the other day was talking about like the need for conservatives to kind of really kind of grasp this idea of kind of, large new form of gentrification. Right. The fear that you're going to have all these blue state refugees come in, particularly here. Like it's something that I'm particularly concerned about because I live in the Panhandle, Bay County. We have a large-scale land developer that is trying to bring in 100,000 people It's a Jimmy Buffett branded retirement center for active boomers, and so like
Florida thing I've ever heard.
Oh yeah, it's great. But the problem is that, okay, well, imagine if they attract a demographic, let's say 60-40 blue. Well, all of a sudden that dramatically changes the political landscape here. I mean, for example, we have someone that attends local city council meetings here in Panama City Beach. Again, as you know, we've got the best flag in the country. It's a woman in a bikini out. Yeah, it's just great. Personal favorite. And she wants to come in, and she moved here 4 years ago. And she comes in here railing, "Oh, this is a sexist flag. We need to change it." Like, how dare you move somewhere and then try to change our symbols that have been around decades?
Right.
And that's the danger. And I think Jeff Dice, again, the president of the Mises Institute, he came. I run a group here called the Republican Roundtable, and he addressed this question of, how do we proactively create structures that incentivize? There you go. That incentivize the right people, people that have respect for people whose values are aligned with the local population. How do we attract those people rather than Seattle, people from Seattle and Portland and people that want to Californianize the Panhandle?
Right.
And so one of the things I'm trying to do is that Bay County was a plus 53 county. I think it's important for our local leaders to look at things like naming things after President Trump, considering the amount of loyalty. And in the state of Florida, I think there's like 6 or 7 roads in the state of Florida already named after Barack Obama. In the Panhandle, we should have some roads named after Donald Trump.
Amen.
We should have, we should be repealing some of a few years ago, the Florida Republican Party made a huge miscalculation after the Parkland shooting and passed some really bad gun legislation. We should be repealing that. We should be trying to do everything we can to attract people that are interested in cryptocurrency. There's all sorts of little policy things that are signals to the people that have respect for the values that are making Florida so good right now. And so again, you could proactively think about these policies because when you attract these even the symbolic ones have long-term substantive consequences by attracting the right people here and creating walls against people that are hostile and would undermine and subvert the issues that have made Florida great in the first place. Because the last thing we want is for Florida to really become what California was in the same way as this decay of a once great state.
Yo, you're absolutely right. And hopefully you guys will buck the trend that seems to have plagued not only just states, but just the West in general. It just seems to be the cyclical nature that's just completely counterintuitive. And, it's that meme, with the Roman Empire, it's like good times create weak men. And then it just goes back and forth and back and forth. It's a horrible cycle. But,
actually, one point of this, Georgia is one of the best examples of it.
Oh, yeah.
The
South is changing. Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, don't become Virginia.
Yeah. For example, Virginia, it's one of those states, because we talk about this in terms of rural versus urban divides, and I think that's useful. But I think it's also important when you really kind of narrow down there, it comes down to college education, particularly postgraduate levels. And so Virginia's trending leftwards has coincided. And there's been a lot of things.
It's correlated with the rise.
But also a massive increase of the percentage of its population that has postgraduate degrees and college degrees. And so if Republican legislators throughout the country really want to get serious about this demographics issue, which in this case, again, is education focused. Yep. We can talk about
full funding from these schools, stop subsidizing the loans, guaranteeing the loans, and just have that whole system collapse on its head. Because, even 20, 30 years ago, the education you were getting was very different. It's not only that more people are getting the education, it's that the education is more indoctrination than it was, say, 40 years ago. And if they actually had to provide, services on a free market and they weren't just propped up by the feds and the state governments, then, maybe their curriculum would start changing. But we're not going to see that unless, of course, we pull the funding.
Because 20 years ago, the old hands and the university, again, you had tenure for that. They were like pre, 60s, 70s revolution people, right? I mean, these are people that fought in World War II.
Right.
Now the people that are the old establishment scholars in these universities are the products of the 60s and 70s.
Right.
And meanwhile, it's only gotten worse since then.
Oh God, imagine what's going to be in 20, 30 years.
And the problem is that the West has created so many institutions that produce a
decay.
I mean, our elites are awful. Like there was a stupid tweet by it was a presidential historian who does stuff at NBC. And
he didn't even know about Lincoln. He didn't even know about Lincoln executive order.
Can you imagine Lincoln saying not nice things about the press? Like he arrested like over 300 journalists. Like
a lot of people have been talking about this lately. I saw a great tweet from Cernovich the other day. I know Darren Beatty's been talking about it. Basically,
Beatty's fantastic.
Beatty's fantastic. I definitely want him on once this podcast gets its legs. But the elites in the West are so morally bankrupt. They're so intellectually bankrupt, and they're just propped up by these legacy institutions. But they have no real grassroots support. They have no real redeeming characteristics anymore. And people like Cernovich put out, and they said they basically broke down into three, that there's this old decaying elite, which is responsible for the decay in our society. Then there's the great clueless masses who are just, basically the proles, I guess in Orwellian terms. And then there's this new elite of people who are engaged, who are, reading and who are following what's going on and, bettering themselves. And maybe if we can find a movement that ties the legitimate grievances of the masses with this new burgeoning elite, that's when we could start to see some political success. And Beatty talked about that as well. He said that a populist movement has no legs unless it can find some home with some sort of elites or aspiring elites who have capital, who have wealth, who have resources to prop up, basically just these legitimate grievances. And if you look throughout history, there's countless examples throughout, especially Western civilization, where all these legitimate uprisings from the people, from the peasantry, whoever it is, were always squashed. And the only times they were successful, maybe I was going to say the U.S. may be different, but they were always squashed unless they had support from the elites. In the United States, for instance, with the revolution, they pointed out that there was actually an elite-driven revolution. I mean, many of the great, founding fathers were some of the wealthiest individuals in the United States, and they had some of the, they were landed, they had resources. Obviously, there was popular support, but it had that elite support. Do you agree with that consensus, that idea?
Yes, I think it was one of the persons that I think is kind of had a good view on this is Michael Malice said, I think it was an old quote of his, but he talks about how he's both an anarchist and elitist. And he's an elitist because he does recognize that there is natural hierarchy, but he's an anarchist, and he recognizes that the current structure, the current politicized institutions that establish the hierarchy are arbitrary and crap. Yep. And so when he has a conversation,
it's not based on merit.
Yeah. And so when you have a conversation with someone, you want to try to figure out, are they your superior, your inferior, and then because you can't just do it based on title, and that's the truth. Like we have to have a system that rewards the best of us and recognizes their contributions, because we are not all equal.
And titles mean nothing anymore. I mean, college degrees mean nothing. You can't use anyone's pedigree anymore to judge their level of education, their intellect, whatever. I mean, maybe 50, 60 years ago, those things were good as kind of like a heuristic to basically gauge people. But nowadays, you can meet the dumbest people who went to top schools. You can meet the dumbest people with lofty titles in DC. It doesn't mean anything anymore, because that hierarchy that you're talking about, that Michael Malice was talking about, is completely broken from the top down.
And that's one of the things I've always I'm a romantic at heart about the American experiment. And like, even if you go back to the American Revolution, one of the things that made it so great is that some of Washington's best generals were self-taught men. I mean, it was like people like Nathaniel Greene and Harry Knox and Alexander Hamilton. Like these were not people that had long military careers before the war. I mean, they were largely self-taught. They read books about military strategy. They were just very capable, and they outshined a lot of the veterans that had experience serving in the Royal Army. And so those were the leaders that actually stood up and were able to lead us to victory against the British, against the greatest empire the world had ever known.
But hierarchy is not a bad thing. Right. Maybe I'm going to go full neo-reactionary here and say we need hierarchy. It can't just be this massive mob.
Hierarchy.
I mean, of course, populism is great as both a tactic. It's both as a way to funnel legitimate grievances, a way to channel all this political energy. But you also need to recognize, institutions. You need to recognize some sort of hierarchy, because you can't build a society just based on pure, emotion and the masses' anger. You need something there that's concrete. The problem is our institutions are so bankrupt and useless that we've gotten this whole mentality of just being purely anti-institutional. without any basis in it. It's more about the current institutions rather than institutionalism as a whole, right?
And absolutely correct. And I think that's one of the very encouraging things that we've seen on the right is that it's not simply a focus on tearing down institutions, but building up parallel
new ones.
Right?
Yeah.
And again, like in terms of large scale consequences here, like this is where I think something like Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is so exciting, because when we have, I mean, what the Fed is doing is absolutely insane. The exciting thing is that, as more people recognize, again, the fact that there's consequences, the Fed creating 22% of its money base in 2020 alone, at that same time, you have Bitcoin rise up. When YouTube and these big tech giants, and they censor, suppress, anything that goes outside of the acceptable index card of allowable opinion, you create new things that pop up. This is an exciting time because not only can we focus on the failures of these completely eroded, corrupted institutions, but build up new ones.
Yep.
Because without that, then that's how societies are destroyed. Is when nothing is there to prop up. Because these institutions, it's like the old conservative adage, like don't tear down a fence until you realize it was put up in the first place. We're not just tearing down fences. We're building fences and then tearing down the rotten ones.
Correct.
That's what's important. And again, the fact that we have so many talented people connected and recognizing, again, even if the ultimate, there's some disagreements on what the ultimate end goal looks like, people are recognizing, again, it's the new right.
We need change. We
recognize the left for what it is. And this is also where like political decentralization becomes so important, because as long as we can agree that we can have that we don't, and this is my biggest issue with like the American nationalist movement going on, is because they seem to think that, oh well, if we simply had like the right, we had good government on with this federal scale, then we'd be okay because it would be reinforcing all these good conservative values. I think that's the wrong way of viewing it. America is not a unified nation, never was a unified nation. What we need is a government that recognizes that and be a lot more like Switzerland than say Prussia, right? And I think that's, those are lessons unique to American history that, again, we can have disagreements about what that end goal should look like, so long as we can recognize our common
well, there's no national consensus anymore. I mean, everything that we used to hold dear and we used to find that this was some commonality, that there was no disagreements on, that's all gone out the window. I mean, we don't agree on anything. I mean, within the right, within the left, between the right, between the left. I mean, but I love the idea of both building new institutions and taking over existing institutions. I mean, you and me are doing the same thing. I mean, you're rising in your local party, the Republican Party, that's an institution. I took over a club here that has a long storied history. It was previously a liberal Rockefeller institution. Now it's pretty much a populist institution. But even on the micro level, but even on the micro level, if these continue to happen, it's slowly but surely you'll build a bedrock from which to actually build a feasible movement. Otherwise, it's going to collapse and it's just personality driven. Thank God, though, we do have a personality like Trump, because he's certainly an accelerator. He's an accelerationist, and he's pushed us with the Overton window in terms of his policies, and he's held the line in a lot of things that without him, things would have crumbled sooner. We would have been in a way worse position. So love him or hate him or think he's been successful or not successful. I mean, he's obviously made some personnel decisions I didn't really fancy, but him as an individual, I mean, even with this election, I mean, he would, anyone else would have conceded. It doesn't matter how great they were on issues. It doesn't matter how much I like them. If they were a senator or governor, whoever, he was the only person I could conceivably see within the Republican Party who would have stood his ground and said, this is stolen, we have to push back. That's a huge, we need to take advantage of that. And we have to recognize that that's great for everything else we're trying to do within the broader movement, right?
Yeah, that's like any libertarian out there that's like, they bash Trump because, oh, well, his policies weren't libertarian. It's like, well, he's not a libertarian. He didn't run as a libertarian.
Right. But don't get involved in politics if you don't agree with winning on the margins.
Exactly.
You're never going to get utopia overnight. It's about these small battles, these small victories, having some peace, no new wars, no new troops on the ground, to taunt with North Korea, marginal tax rates dropping. I mean, these things are concrete policies that may not be ideal 100%, but they improve people's lives. I mean, if I ran a business and he came out and said, we're going to lower the corporate tax rate by 10%. That's a real thing for me. I mean, I would obviously want it to be zero, but I'm still getting 10% back of my income. So I'm going to be happy for that. And now I can set the basis is at a lower level and we can push for the next 10%. But if you can't get that first victory, you're never going to get more victories. So, I mean, that's why the circle jerk of the neckbeards never gets anywhere.
Right. And again, I fully support pardoning Ed Snowden and Assange and things. But like, if the thing that mattered more to your average business in your community, which is what you should be cared about, is that tax cut and all the deregulation over pardoning Assange and Snowden. Again, that'd be
which she may still do anyway.
Which she still might do.
Yeah.
But what I also find, and the other thing about Trump is that it's not even just about the policies; it's the normalization of all these concepts. I have people that were, Rick Santorum supporters here in Bay County who are now actively going on Facebook talking about abolishing the FBI because they saw what the FBI did to Trump, and they recognize that the FBI can do that to Trump. They can do that to them.
The Overton window, it's a beautiful thing.
State, all of this sort of stuff. I mean, and again, now you have Rush Limbaugh talking about secession.
Yeah.
Because you have 40+% of the country.
Well, I want to talk about that. I want to talk about balkanization and decentralization, because we could talk about it within a federal structure, but if tensions rise and they continue to I mean, because we're not in a healthy place as a society. I mean, we are a divided country. I mean, anyone who's going to claim that the country is not completely divided and bankrupt and lost its footing is absolutely lying. I mean, obviously there's exceptions on a regional basis, but as a whole, I mean, we've never been more divided since maybe the Civil War. I mean, I know you would love to see maybe some kind of balkanization and stuff like that, but I mean, do you think we're heading in that direction?
It's always difficult to tell. I think we're definitely trending towards political decentralization of some form. The thing is, we've already seen it. I remember back in the peak Tea Party days, and you had like what's his Tom Davis, who was a senator in South Carolina, state senator. Mm-hmm. He was trying to get the South Carolina state government to proactively say that they would not enforce any gun control regulation that the Obama administration was trying to pass. So again, South Carolina has a long history of standing up to the feds. I mean, that's historically has been their thing. Obama was extremely unpopular, and guns is one of the golden issues. Right. It should have been a slam dunk. It never got done. Florida, we tried to do something similar. Republican states weren't willing to stand up really to the Obama administration. The closest they came was not expanding Obamacare with Medicare, the Medicaid expansion to Obamacare, right? Well, the last 4 years, you've seen Democrat governors do just that against Trump, right? That's when the sanctuary cities on immigration came in. That's when you saw the COVID massively expanded.
They've nullified. They've pretty much de facto nullified certain policies from the Fed.
And so what I'm interested is now, because of the last 4 years, because of the trumpeting of the GOP combined with what they've seen the left, the blue states are doing, will the GOP now be as aggressive against Biden should there not be a legal solution to, again, what it looks like a very fraudulent election?
Yep.
Assuming that Biden is inaugurated, will the red states stand up for their citizens the same way that blue states had the last 4 years? And I think, and I'm comfortable in Florida thinking that Ron DeSantis will. And one of the things, like my party, my first day on right after my election to vice chairman, I got a resolution passed that said that the Bay County Republican Party will refuse to acknowledge Joe Biden as a legitimate president unless Trump concedes. And so we will now, for 4 years, we will officially describe any Democrat president. Let's assume, we have to keep into Kamala Harris may end up there sooner rather than later. But any Democrat president in the next 4 years will only be referred to by the Bay County Republican Party as president imposed.
Wow, and my hope, that's very good. I like that.
My hope is that we need other Republican parties standing up and doing this, because again, what that does, it sends a message that, and particularly now, the threat to the Republican Party is not the left so much as it is the base believing that the party does not stand for them. And guess what? In Bay County, the people here know that the Republican Party cares more about standing up for what their self-governance than they are trying to make nice with the Democrats and the media. And
I would love the text of that resolution. I think the NYRC would love to use it.
I was very happy with this one.
Perfect. And then also, I mean, you were seeing some pushback already. I mean, what is it? 18 states now have signed on to this suit. I mean, that's a great start. It's a third of the states. I mean, I would love, depending on how this goes, obviously I fully agree it's a fraudulent election. I still think there's some kind of a path for Trump, and, we're in unprecedented times. So who knows what's going to happen the next 2 months.
Trump's president, anything can happen.
Exactly. But even let's say in the worst case scenario, Biden gets in, I would love to see these states call a constitutional convention. I would support that. I would support any kind of radical move that could limit the power of the feds, that could delegitimize them in any way. And we can have some states with some backbone pushing back. I think that's a very positive development, regardless of who's in charge, because, you know, we may have Trump for 4, 8 years, whatever it is, but he's not going to be there forever. And we're probably going to have someone else who's way worse in terms of policy. So if we can empower the states to regain some of the rights that they are, you know, that they do come with being states within this union, I think that's a positive development, and libertarians should recognize that.
And again, Darren Beatty has been one of the best people out there painting this drum, is that the biggest threat to American liberty is not people in a tent in the Middle East, not even China. As bad as China is, yeah, it's pretty bad. It's they're in America.
It's domestic. It's domestic. Yeah.
It's corporate giants that, again, that have no problem trying. And what's interesting, like the Democratic Party, you know, elites have been pining for years for America to be more like China. And this is exactly what they want. They want a one-party rule. They want to be able to outset all the censorship to big tech, all that. The threat to American liberty is domestic. And now, and again, I think that 6 years ago, your average Republican voter thought ISIS was a bigger threat than DC. Now, I think that's not the case. And again, these are the issues that can't, you know, Trump going away doesn't change it. And again, I can't wait. If we have 4 years of Donald Trump dunking on Biden on a daily basis, as his administration is an absolute failure. Biden has even managed to underserve my own expectations for him. Like, I thought he was going to throw a bone out to the left and bring in like Bernie Sanders as a labor secretary. You know, for one, I thought he would want Bernie Sanders out of the Senate. I mean, he's actively alienating a political left that has gotten used to non-political action. Yeah. And so you're in Portland, for example. I mean, you have the Antifa activists in Portland that are still on the streets. For one, that Portland mayoral election doesn't get enough attention. The fact that Miller won over that, in spite of everything, is actually really fascinating. But they're still in the streets in Portland.
And you saw him grow a backbone now. Now he's like, oh, we're sending the police, we're shutting down these camps, we're shutting down this apartment zone. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there is some kind of internal schism brewing on the left. And, you know, if you could see it in a place like Portland, which is about as close to the lion's den of leftism in this country. I mean, it makes Greenwich Village look like a right-wing utopia. You know, it's just insane. But that's another example of decentralization. I never thought in the United States we would have autonomous communes. Like, what is this, Paris in circa 1880? I mean, it's insane. It's absolutely insane. But this has been fascinating. I definitely want you on again, because this has been a great discussion. We covered a lot of ground here. I want to pass off the last words to you. Also use the time to just plug in where people can follow you, Mises, etc., everything you're doing. And I hope you could come back on again, Tho. Yeah, this has been great. Again, you can follow me on Twitter at Tho Bishop, THOBISHOP. You can find Mises, MISES.org. If you want a free economics book, the best one ever published, Economics in One Lesson, it's at Mises.org/one lesson. Totally free, shipping, all of that, totally free. But you know, my hat's off to you and Vish and the New York City Young Republican Club. Yeah, it's amazing. There's not a Libertarian Party organization out there that is living the principle more than your organization has. And the fact that you guys are able to do it where you're at, you are setting an example. And this is the tone that when we restore America, it is going to be people like you and Vish, you know, doing out there and leading. So again, my hat's off to you. This was fun. I look forward to joining you in the future. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I can vouch for Economics in One Lesson, one of the most life-changing books I've ever read. If I ever ran a right-wing junta, that would be mandated reading in our state schools. But anyway, guys, tune in. We'll have another episode soon. Thank you all for joining the Waxcast.